The woman stepped off the freight platform at Pinto Creek with a daughter on her hip and a second child inside her, and she looked once at the dying stand of oaks, once at the dusty street, and then she walked into the only place still lit at sundown, a trading post with a sign over the porch that read Brewer's Sons, and she asked the man behind the counter, in the kind of voice that has stopped pretending to be all right, "Please, can my children sleep here tonight?" She did not say her name. She did not say where she had come from. She just stood there, holding the braided head of the child against her shoulder, and waited the way a person waits who has already been told no so many times that yes would frighten her. If you were settling in tonight with a cup of something warm, I would love to know where you are listening from. There is usually a kitchen table somewhere, or a porch, or a little chair by a window. Whatever it is, say it out loud or leave it in the comments, because we keep each other company up in here, and it is a long evening if we don't. Caleb Brewer looked up from the ledger he was finishing. He was 43 years old, which was older than he wanted to be. He had buried his wife Margaret in February of the year before, and he had not yet taken her bonnet down from the hat rack, because his daughter Pearl said it made the house look less like a place where someone used to be. He had been a freighter for 20 years and a shopkeeper for 3, and he had seen every kind of weary the high road brings through a man's front door. He had not, until that minute, seen weariness of this particular kind. The little girl on the woman's hip had stopped crying. The woman herself was 6 months along by the look of her, the kind of 6 months where the body has stopped pretending it is not true. A smaller boy, maybe 3, was asleep against her other thigh, the wagon dust still on his boots. Her shoes were tied together with twine. Her collar was yellowed at the turning with sweat. She had carried the bundle on her back for a long way, and Caleb could see by the small, even way she set it down that everything inside it mattered. "Sit," he said, and pointed at the stool by the pickle barrel, and reached up to the shelf for the tin of crackers and the jar of peaches. He did not ask a question. He put the food down beside her. Then he went to the back and brought out the quilt his mother had pieced. "There is a small room off the kitchen," he said. "It has a bed and a window and a lamp. The roof does not leak unless there is thunder. The children can sleep there." The woman stood very still for a moment with the crackers untouched in front of her. Then, quietly, she said, "Thank you, sir." She said it the way you thank someone when you have not been thanked in a long time. Her name was Adalida Calloway. She had been Adalida Hollis until 2 years before, when her husband Josiah Hollis, the youngest son of Thaddeus Hollis, the biggest cattle king in the county, had died of swamp fever on a drive down to the coast. Thaddeus had not attended the funeral. He had sent word instead, by his foreman, that Adalida would be given 90 days to vacate the North Pasture house and to surrender, to the foreman's hand, every paper, every letter, every scrap of writing that had Josiah's name on it. He had made it clear, in the careful way rich men make things clear, that if she did not, he would have the law explain it. She had not, at that time, known what she was carrying. She knew only that she had a daughter, Lila, who was 3.5 and would not stop asking where her father had gone, and that she was close on with another child, and that Thaddeus Hollis's house, the big house on the rise, had not once asked her in past the kitchen since the day Josiah brought her home. She had been a schoolteacher from a town too small to print itself on a map. Josiah had wanted her. Thaddeus had considered that a discourtesy to the family line. In the year before he died, Josiah had begun to give her small things. A folded paper here, a leather envelope there. He had said it was his way of making sure she would not be left empty-handed if anything happened to him, and she had thought he meant jewelry, or a keepsake, or some trinket she could sell if it came to that. Now, walking down the long ridge from the North Pasture to the freight road, with the bundle bumping against her back every step of the way, she had begun to understand he had meant something else entirely. She had walked the last 4 miles in the dark to make sure of one thing. Thaddeus's foreman, a thin red-headed man named Briggs who could ride a circle around a bottle without spilling a drop, had come to the North Pasture house the day before, on an errand she knew had nothing to do with branding or hay. He had not known she was watching from the smoke shed, but she had seen him slide the latch on the gate and look once at the window. She had known what he had come for, and she had gone out the back way across the wash, with Lila on her hip and 3-year-old Jem on her ankle, before breakfast. If she had been the Adalida of 2 years ago, she would have waited. She would have set the table and poured the coffee and pretended she was grateful when Briggs called her ma'am in that flat, careful way that means nothing. But the Adalida of 2 years ago had quietly died the night Josiah was buried, and the woman walking down the road now had a yellowed paper in her bundle that she did not yet have the language to read, but that her heart, somewhere underneath her worry, had begun to understand. Hollis was coming, and she could not let him have her children. That first night, while the children slept in the small room off the kitchen with the quilt pulled up to their chins and Jim's thumb in his mouth like a small felony, Adalida sat in the rocker by the lamp and unfolded, slowly, one corner at a time, the leather envelope Josiah had pressed into her hands the week before he died. She had carried it unopened through a funeral, through a year of grief, through a winter with no wood and not enough flour, and across 140 miles of road on her own 2 feet. Now she sat with it in her lap and read it one paper at a time. Caleb came in from the back porch with 2 mugs of coffee. He saw what she was holding and did not say so. He set the mug on the table beside her, and he sat down across from her in his chair and waited. He had known Josiah Hollis in a small way. He had freighted a load of seed for him once, and another time a load of cedar posts, and Josiah had paid him fairly both times and tipped him 20 cents besides, which was a kindness in those parts. Caleb had been at the funeral, standing near the back, hat in hand, and he had watched the old man Thaddeus not come and not send. He had watched the young wife walk out the gate with no one on either side of her, and he had felt the mean little pinch of seeing it. He had not, until this minute, understood what he had seen. The paper on top was a survey map, drawn in a careful hand, of the eastern stretch of pasture between the Big House and Pinto Creek, the land Thaddeus Hollis had always referred to as his. Below the map, in Josiah's handwriting, was a single line. It read, "This land was given to me by my grandfather, Judge Ezekiel Hollis, in the spring of 1869, by his hand and his seal, and at his death it was to be held in trust by me and, after me, by my eldest living child, whether boy or girl." Below that line, in a different ink, was a note. "In the year before this, my father forged an unrecorded deed purporting to transfer this land to himself. My grandfather's notary kept 2 copies. This is one of them. The other is in the bank at San Saba." Adalida read it twice, and then she read it a 3rd time, and then she folded it up the way she had found it and sat looking at the lamp for a long while. "I cannot read a survey," she said at last. Caleb could. He set down his coffee. The trouble, of course, was not what the paper said. The trouble was what came next. In this country, in this year, a paper signed by an unrecorded hand means nothing against a man who has wealth, a name, and a foreman who can ride. Thaddeus Hollis had more of every one of those things than any man in 3 counties. To lay a piece of yellowed parchment on a trustee's desk and say Josiah Hollis had a daughter who was the rightful heir was not a claim. That was a candle held up against a hill fire. The harder choice was not whether to fight. The harder choice was whether to do it honestly. There were faster roads. There was a man in Lampasas who would, for $1's worth of silver, file a fraudulent deed of his own and put it above the other. There was a judge on the river who, for the right favor to his niece, would not ask how a young widow had come by a 500-acre inheritance one winter and a forged title the next. There were 100 ways to win that did not require telling the truth. Each of them meant signing a name, or accepting a favor, or taking $1 that did not belong to her. Adalida made her decision on the 3rd night. The town of Pinto Creek, which was not much of a town, did not know what to make of her. The women at the post office looked her up and down when she came in for her mail with Lila on one arm and Jem on the other, and there was the half-whispered talk that goes through a small place when a stranger settles herself in for a week. The men reading the cattle prices at the bulletin board over by the boarding house said she was either very brave or very foolish, and they did not think the distinction mattered much. But there were smaller kindnesses she had not expected, and they came from the people she had not expected them from. Mrs. Pritchett, the veteran's widow who ran the boarding house and who had buried 2 sons of her own and had not let the town soften her face since, left a basket of dried apples on the back step of Caleb's place one morning and pinned a small note under the twine that read, "For the children, do not thank me." Caleb's daughter Pearl, who had been no warmer to him than a closed window since her mother died in February, and who had learned to keep her kindnesses in jars where no one could see them, asked one afternoon whether the small girl might like to sit with her and string buttons. The schoolmaster, A thin Welshman named Price, who had taught 3 generations of Chandler County children and who had known Josiah Hollis as a boy, walked past the trading post on a Thursday and stopped and stood for a long moment on the porch and finally said through the screen door, "Ma'am, if you should need a scribe for any matter of the law, my hand is steady and my mouth is quieter than my hand." And old Mr. Hightower, who had not said a kind word to anyone in 11 years and was not expected to begin now, tipped his hat to Adalida on the road one Tuesday and said, "Ma'am, I knew your husband. He was a fair man. Whatever you are doing, you do it in his name and not in his father's, and you will be all right." That evening, Adalida, brushing Jim's hair by lamplight, said, almost to herself, "The Lord gives you what you can carry. He just doesn't tell you how far you'll have to walk with it." Caleb didn't answer. There was nothing to add to that. Now, the question that sits in front of every woman like her, the one she has been sitting with quietly her whole life, is not whether she has the right. Of course she has the right. The question is whether the truth alone is ever enough against a man who has been telling his version of a story so long he has stopped hearing anything else. We have all known a Hollis somewhere, and we have all had our own quiet piece of paper we did not know how to read. So I wonder, tonight, as we sit in our kitchens, what would you have done, with 2 children asleep in the next room and the road behind you, and the question still in front of you? Hold that with me for a minute before we go on. That 4th morning, before the sun was up, Caleb came into the kitchen and found her already dressed, with the children's shoes set out by the stove and the bundle open on the table, and a fresh cup of coffee poured for him at his own place. She was looking at him with the kind of steady face a person makes when they are about to ask a thing they have not practiced asking. "I am not going to Lampasas," she said. "I am not paying for a man's name to be put on this paper that does not have any business being there. We are going together, you and me, and Pearl will stay with Mrs. Pritchett, to the bank at San Saba, and we are going to open the second envelope in front of the banker's clerk, and I am going to say my husband's name into a quiet room, and I am going to let the paper speak for itself." Caleb stood there with his hat in his hand, and he could feel the size of what she had just asked. "It is not going to be quiet," he said. "No," she said. "It is not." The storm was on its way. On the 4th night, she slept less than an hour. She rose in the dark and sat with her hands folded on the window ledge and watched the eastern pasture turn slowly from black to the color of pewter. She braided Lila's hair before sunup, carefully, the way her own mother had braided hers in a kitchen in a town too small to print itself on a map. She tied Jim's boots for him twice because he had pulled the first knot loose. She did not speak much. She did not pray aloud. She made a list, on a torn corner of brown paper, of every name she would need to remember at the bank, and when she had written the last one she folded the paper twice and put it in the bundle under the leather envelope. Caleb came down from the loft with his good hat on. He had not worn his good hat in 3 years. Pearl had set out a clean collar for Lila and a comb for Jim. On the 5th morning, she woke to the sound she had been expecting, even knowing, in another part of her mind, that she was wrong to expect it. Caleb's coffee pot had not yet started to whistle. A horse walked slowly past the front of the trading post. Then another, then a third, then a wagon, with a driver who did not look up. Adalida, who had been peeling apples at the kitchen table, set the knife down, and the small steel sound it made when it touched the wood was the loudest sound in the room. Briggs was on a gray gelding with a wool lap robe over his knees. He had his hat pulled low. Behind him, on the seat of the wagon, sat a clerk from the bank at San Saba, a thin man with a waxed mustache and a ledger under his arm, and next to the clerk sat Thaddeus Hollis himself. The old man did not look up. He did not have to. He was letting every person in Pinto Creek understand, in a way they would not soon forget, that the woman at the trading post was the subject of a matter and that he had come personally to bring it to a close. They drew up in front of the porch. Briggs swung down. The clerk did not move. Thaddeus climbed down with the slow, careful dignity of a man who had spent 50 years teaching a county how to stand aside when he entered a room. "Adalida," he said. He used her Christian name the way a man uses a piece of furniture. "I have come for the papers." Caleb came to the door of the trading post with his hand on the jamb. Pearl was behind him, holding Jim against her shoulder and Lila's hand in her own. They were all 4 of them looking at the man on the wagon. You do not live in a country like this without learning the small economies. You learn what not to say in front of which ear. You learn which doors close quietly and which ones you have to push shut yourself. You learn that when a rich man rides into your town, he is not asking permission. He is informing you of a fact. And the fact, in this case, was that Thaddeus Hollis was expecting Adalida to fold the bundle into her arms, walk down the steps, set it on the wagon seat, and thank him kindly for the trouble. She did not move. "Mr. Hollis," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was the voice she had used on her children in the middle of the night when one of them had woken afraid. It was the voice a person uses when they are about to say a thing they are not going to unsay. "I am not giving you my husband's last words." The clerk's mustache twitched. Briggs looked down at his gloves. And Thaddeus Hollis, who had not been denied a thing in 15 years, and who had outlived every man who ever tried, lifted his hat from his knee very slowly, in the slow way a man does when he wants a town to know he has decided a person is not worth speaking to. Caleb felt Pearl's hand tighten on the back of his shirt. "Papa," she said, very quietly, into his shoulder. "That is Mr. Sanders. He used to come over to Mama's house in Lampasas when I was little. Mama called him cousin." Caleb went still. "He is the one who sealed it. I remember. He sealed the second copy, and he put it in the box, and Mama was the one who carried it to the bank." This was the sound of a small, quiet thing the audience had been waiting for. It did not solve the day. It deepened it. Thaddeus had not yet, in his careful planning, accounted for the fact that the notary had been Pearl's cousin. Adalida did not lean against the doorframe. She did not move her hand to her belly. She stood in such a way that she made the kitchen door look like a held line. "Mr. Sanders," she said, "you put your seal on 2 papers in February of 1869 in the office of Judge Ezekiel Hollis. One of those papers is on the table inside. I would like you to look at it." The clerk looked at Thaddeus. Thaddeus looked at the road. "Mr. Sanders," Adalida said again, "I am asking you to do the thing you took an oath to do, and I am asking you in front of witnesses. There are presently 7 persons on this porch who will remember what you answered." The clerk set his ledger down on his own knee. He set it down with the careful slowness of a man who is revising, in real time, every calculation he has made in the last 20 years. "Ma'am," he said finally, very softly, "I will step down and look at what you have." Thaddeus turned his head in the direction of his foreman. "Briggs," he said, very quietly. And Briggs, who had been on this earth long enough to know the exact temperature of a moment when it is about to break, lifted one gloved hand, and rode forward, and stopped, and waited. That was the moment. The day cracked in 2. Half of it stood with the thin clerk on the ground. Half of it stood with the rich man on the wagon. And Adalida Calloway, who had been in the world for 31 years, and who had never once in her life ordered anything more than a stack of flour from a drummer, was the only person in Pinto Creek that morning who knew which half of the day was going to hold. The clerk's name was Marcellus Sanders. He had not done a kind thing for a long time. He had put his name at the bottom of a great many papers, and very few of them, in the back of his mind, had been the kind of paper he wanted to meet on a Wednesday morning. He had time, now, to regret only one of them. He came down off the wagon. He set his ledger on the porch rail. He did not look at Thaddeus again. He walked past Briggs, and Briggs let him, because Briggs understood, in the way a man who has been in many rooms with many bosses understands, that the room had changed. Adalida did not show him the leather envelope. She unfolded it herself, slowly, one paper at a time, the way she had unfolded it in front of the lamp 3 nights before. The map, the line in her husband's careful hand, the notary's seal. She did not hand it across. She set it on Caleb's kitchen table, and she asked the banker to step inside the door, and the banker did, and he stood at the table for a long time with his hat in his hand. When he looked up, his face was the face of a person who has, after a long walk, surprised himself by arriving early at something he had hoped never to meet. "This is the second envelope," he said. "I will testify to it." He did not say anything else that morning. He wrote his testimony into the ledger he had brought with him. He did not charge a fee. He asked for a glass of water. Pearl brought it to him on a tin plate, and he drank it with both hands around the glass because his hands were shaking. Then he handed it back to Adalida, not across the table, but the way a man hands a thing he is grateful to be finished with. She folded it the same way she had found it. She put it in her bundle. She put the bundle on the hook by the door where her coat usually hung. Caleb led the banker out. He led him past Briggs, who said nothing. He led him past Thaddeus, who said nothing. He led him to the wagon and watched him climb back up. Briggs waited until the wagon had cleared the yard. Then he lifted the brim of his hat to Adalida, who was standing on the porch with Lila's hand in one of hers, and he turned his gray gelding slowly around, and he rode out of Pinto Creek. Thaddeus did not follow. The clerk did not look back. In the kitchen that evening, Lila fell asleep in Caleb's lap with the last button on the string she had been working all week. Jim was already in the small room. Pearl had closed the door. The lamp was at half wick. The coffee was hot in the pot. Adalida sat in the rocker and looked at Caleb and did not say anything for a long time. "Thank you," she said. "You said that the first night. This is a different one." She was looking at her hands. "I have been 61 days being afraid," she said. "I was afraid the whole year before that. I was afraid when I was 12. I have been afraid so long I have lost track of what the word means. And today is the first time in 61 days that I am only tired." Caleb, who had carried her husband's saddlebag in his freight wagon for 3 winters after the funeral without ever opening it, and who had carried it through her door that morning without being asked, set the mug down and stood, and walked to the hook by the door, and took down the bundle, and set it in front of her. "This is yours," he said. "You carried it in. You carry it out. Whatever comes of it, it is yours." He had carried her husband's saddlebag through 3 winters without asking her any questions at all. He figured he could carry her through one more. Pearl, who had been drying a plate at the sink and not pretending not to listen, set the plate down. She did not turn around. "Papa," she said, "I would like to go too." 2 weeks later, when the banker's clerk had signed what was required and the trustees and Lampasses had held their meeting and the deed had been confirmed, Adalida did not move into the big house on the rise. She did not ride out on horseback to walk the eastern pasture. She did not, in any public way, mark herself as anything other than a young widow with 2 children who had been given, by the lawful kindness of her husband's grandfather, the right to sit on her own porch and not be moved from it. She wrote Thaddeus Hollis a single letter, 3 sentences long, polite, signed Adalida Calloway on the 3rd line, in which she told him she would not be filing on the eastern pasture. She told him she would lease it to him at the going rate so long as he paid the leases to the bank in trust for Lila. She told him there was nothing between them now, and she wished him well. Pearl caught Caleb looking at the letter over the kitchen table, and she said, "Why did she do that?" And Caleb said, "Because her husband was a fair man, and she is raising his children." There is something that happens when you have watched someone be steady for a long time that gets into your chest and does not leave for a while. If you felt that just now, this hour, I would be grateful for a like on this video. It tells the road what to bring up here next. And if you have never subscribed, this would be a quiet, decent night to do it. We have a lot more kitchens to sit in. Thaddeus Hollis did not write back. He did not come to Pinto Creek. He did not, in any version of the story I have been able to find, ever acknowledge to anyone outside his own kitchen that the eastern pasture had been quietly returned to the hands it should have stood in all along. He paid the lease. He paid it on time. He paid it for 14 years, and the season he passed, which was in March of the year Pearl turned 19, the lease went on being paid by his son, because by then there was a contract on the deed and his son understood, in the slow practical way sons of difficult men sometimes learn, that the practical thing is rarely the loud one. The town of Pinto Creek did not, in any visible way, change its mind about her overnight. It changed its mind about her the way a town changes its mind about a thing that turns out to be true, which is slowly, and without saying it out loud. They began to nod at her on the road. They began to tip their hats to her daughter. They began to call her by her Christian name, without any man's name after it, the way women her age in that part of the country were addressed only when the town had decided they had earned it. Lila learned to read on Caleb's porch. Pearl wound buttons for her. Jim learned to ride on the gray gelding Briggs had left behind, which Briggs had, in a brief note pinned to the saddle, said he figured a boy ought to have one to grow into. And Adalida Calloway, who had asked on a Tuesday evening if her children could sleep here tonight, married Caleb Brewer on a Saturday in September in the small chapel at Pinto Creek, with the leather envelope on the seat beside her, because Caleb had felt, since the morning he had carried it back across the kitchen, that it ought to be there. The preacher who married them was the same one who had married her to Josiah, and he had cried at both weddings, and he said, both times, that he had not understood until after, which a man has to be a certain age to say and mean. Lila, who was 7 by then and had learned to braid her own hair on Caleb's porch, carried a small bunch of late clover tied with kitchen twine. Jem, who was 6 and had ridden the gray gelding every morning of the summer, stood up very straight in his good boots and held his mother's hand in his left hand and held the preacher's elbow in his right because he had been told to keep still. Pearl stood behind them in a dress her mother had left folded in a cedar chest, and she cried exactly once and quietly and wiped her face on the heel of her hand. The leather envelope went back into the cedar chest after the wedding and was not opened again in that house. The land stayed on the deeds. The leases kept going to the bank in trust for a girl who would one day inherit them, who would one day teach her own daughters in a small schoolhouse at Pinto Creek that the most ordinary-looking piece of paper in your grandmother's trunk is sometimes the one that held up the whole roof. Years later, on a Sunday afternoon in late October, when the eastern pasture had been quietly under her name for nearly a decade, she would sit on the front porch with a mug between her hands and watch the light move down the road toward the big house on the rise. The wind off the creek would be moving the exact direction it had moved on the afternoon she had walked in. And she would think, not for the first time, but finally without any pain in it, that the Lord has a strangely patient way of letting you find your way home. You walk until your shoes wear out, and then the road turns out to be the front porch. Next week, we are going to sit in a different kitchen. There is a cold morning in Montana in the year 1891, and a girl of 17 is about to walk into a telegraph office with a coin in her hand and a piece of paper that has changed the life of a man she has never met. If you would like to be there when she tells him what she has read, I will keep a chair for you. From my kitchen to yours, thank you for being here tonight.